I'm gonna admit that I'm pretty much an Arnold Schwarzenegger superfan, so I'm not exactly the most objective viewer of this film. I did put Sabotage on my bottom 10 last year, however, so I am able to admit it on the rare occasion that the man makes a dud. With or without the always delightful presence of Arnie, this was a really interesting film that takes the very bombastic zombie genre and does something much more thoughtful. It's not a horror movie or a thriller, it's a slow burn character study with some pretty effective zombie apocalypse world building on the fringes. It's essentially a movie about a father dealing with the grief of losing his daughter to a disease, only that disease is zombie. It's well made by first-timer Henry Hobson, and of course, Schwarzenegger is great, giving a much quieter, more reserved performance than we typically expect from the man. Yes, like pretty much everyone else in the world, I loved Mad Max Fury Road. Directed perfectly by George Miller, without any of the chaotic cuts or overly shaky camera work that mars so many contemporary blockbusters, the action here just keeps ramping up until you think, no, they can't possibly top that. Then they top that. The final action sequence, in particular, is a balletic, crazy over-the-top symphony of jaw-droppingly choreographed mayhem. It's amazing. Miller's use of CGI to complement the bedrock of practical effects and stunt work is an absolute masterclass in how to do modern effects. On second viewing, I found that the movie dragged a bit around the middle, but with action this good, honestly, who cares? And on the complete opposite end of the spectrum from Mad Max, we have Brooklyn, a quiet and moving drama about a young woman from Ireland who moves to America in the 1950s. Featuring confident, unflashy direction by John Crowley and a spectacularly performance from Saoirse Ronan, the film is low-key but abundantly compelling from start to finish. It's not the type of movie that's going to blow anyone's mind, it's just so pleasant. I know that seems like faint praise, but there's definitely something to be said for an old-fashioned drama, one that's really solidly constructed and filled with great performances without trying to reinvent the wheel. It's kind of funny that in a year that an actual James Bond movie came out, it was so thoroughly outbonded not only by Kingsman, which is ostensibly a spoof, but also by a new Mission Impossible film, and even by The Man from U.N.C.L.E. But of the several spy-themed films that came out this year, Kingsman: The Secret Service was by far the best. The biggest surprise here might be how great Colin Firth is as a Bond stand-in. I'll take him over the dour Daniel Craig any day of the week. He perfectly pulls off that classic Bond combination of slick suaveness and badassery. Taron Egerton is just as good as his protege, and the film recalls Edgar Wright at his best, where it feels like both a parody of and a legit entry in the genre it's taking on. It's funny, legitimately thrilling, and just a whole lot of fun. Quentin Tarantino has, more and more, been making films that essentially boil down to a series of long scenes in which people try to out-talk each other. Well, I don't know where he goes from here, because I think with The Hateful Eight, he's taken that construct to its logical conclusion. The whole movie consists almost entirely of one very long scene in which people try to out-talk each other. You'd think that would result in a film that feels stagey or stead, but between Tarantino's expectedly crackling dialogue and the ultra-widescreen 70mm cinematography, it feels like something bigger and more cinematic than just a chamber piece. It drags a bit in the middle, but not as much as you'd think, considering that it's 3 hours long and takes place entirely in one room. It recalls Reservoir Dogs in more ways than one, and since that's still my favorite Tarantino film by quite a stretch, that's definitely not a bad thing. If there was any doubt that Pixar are still the masters of creating universally lovable films that are delightful for toddlers and seniors alike, I think Inside Out clinches it. It's basically a road movie, but with the setting being an exhilaratingly unique take on what goes on inside of a child's head, and the characters being personifications of the child's major emotions. It's a pretty ingenious concept for a movie, and Pixar does their usual thing with it and makes it amazing. Watching these characters travel through parts of the brain like dream production, long-term memory storage, and abstract thought adds a delightful twist to a fairly familiar story. Given the film's concept, you'd think that the characters might all be one note, but the film definitely avoids that. Smart, thoughtful sci-fi with something to say is not something that tends to show up in theaters all that often these days, so I was definitely hoping Ex Machina would be good. It's writer Alex Garland's first time out as director, and he definitely acquits himself quite well. Like The Hateful Eight, it mostly takes place in one location, and under a lesser filmmaker, could have come off uncinematic and stagey. But there are some downright riveting scenes here, and a very palpable sense of dread and unease that becomes more pronounced as the movie goes on, along with a trio of amazing performances from Alicia Vikander, Donald Gleason, and Oscar Isaac. I'm gonna admit that the prospect of yet another in a long line of Oscar-hopeful biopics that open in the last few months of the year kinda makes my eyes glaze over. These types of movies tend to feel like they're ticking off boxes and trying very hard to go for bland mainstream appeal rather than do anything interesting. Steve Jobs worked for me in a way that I don't think any other biopic has up to this point. It has a vibrancy and a sense of energy that I found irresistible. I heard someone refer to it as the Mad Max Fury Road of talking, and yeah, that sounds about right. There's a driving intensity to the conversations in this film that's pretty spectacular. It's written by Aaron Sorkin, who absolutely crams the film with the type of stylized, rapid-fire dialogue that he's become famous for, and director Danny Boyle brings the proceedings a good dose of style without ever going overboard, as he tends to do. It's easily my favorite of his films. But really, what gives this movie so much of its heart is Michael Fassbender as Jobs himself. He's perfect in the role, striking a great balance between charm, arrogance, and genuine humanity. There's been a lot of talk about how The Force Awakens borrows liberally from the original trilogy, A New Hope in particular, and yeah, that's true, hard to argue with that. But after the notoriously underwhelming prequels, it's hard to fault J.J. Abrams and company from going back to the well. And setting aside the distinct been there done that feeling, there's so much that this film does right. As we've learned from bland would-be movie stars like Jai Courtney, Charlie Hunnam, and Sam Worthington, charisma and screen presence aren't all that easy to come by, so the fact that Abrams managed to bring us a group of new characters who are also immediately likable and memorable is a small miracle in and of itself. I got just as much joy spending time with the new characters as I did with Han Solo, which is an accomplishment that shouldn't be minimized. There's a reason, beyond the pent-up desire for more Star Wars, why this film has made such an insane amount of money. It's just a really well-made blockbuster. It's propulsive without ever feeling exhausting, with a great sense of pacing, and a whole bunch of really memorable set pieces. As the first chapter in what will most likely be many dozens of future Star Wars films, you really couldn't have asked for much better. A few months after I first saw It Follows, it gave me a nightmare. Aside from the fact that I almost never get nightmares, this wasn't the same night I saw it, or even a week after I saw it. It was months later. That shows you how thoroughly this movie lodged itself in my brain. Stylishly directed by David Robert Mitchell, the film very expertly sets up an atmosphere of tension and dread that really never lets up. It's also legitimately creepy in a way that you don't often see, with a great John Carpenter meets The Ring vibe. The really effective, insanely memorable synth score from Disaster Piece goes a long way towards making the film work as well as it does. But perhaps most importantly, Mitchell strikes the perfect balance between character drama and unnerving horror. I think one of the main tests that separates a very good horror film from a great one is this. If the characters are strong enough that you could remove all the horror elements and still have a movie worth watching, you're probably dealing with something special. It Follows passes that test with flying colors. Not only is it the best horror film of 2015, I think it's one of the best horror films of all time. And now, without comment, here's my bottom 10, set to the theme song from Sanford and Son.